going, and we're live.
Great. Good afternoon. Welcome to Senate Education, Wednesday, April 13th, 1:46 p.m. Jim, great to have you with us.
Great to be here.
So we haven't looked at H456 in a while, and our hope is we know that morning committees are wrapping up next Friday. I'm going to try to push to get everything as close to out of here by then, if not, a little bit the following week. And so I wanted just to put this on the agenda to return to it. And if you don't mind, I'm going to ask you to do two things. I'm going to ask you just to refresh our memories on what the bill itself does, and also see if you've heard through the testimony, and I have my notes as well, if you're seeing any red flags on anything related to this work. I know we've heard from some folks, but please, if you don't mind helping us just to return to this issue, I'd be grateful.
Sure. So for the record, Jim Dammerer, that's counsel. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Good. So we're looking at H456, an act relating to establishing strategic goals and reporting requirements for the Vermont State Colleges. So the first section sets out as a new statute under the VSC chapter in Title 16. It requires VSC to establish priorities and budget and allocate its resources in a manner and an environment that is, and there are four things: affordable, accessible, equitable, and relevant to Vermont needs. And then subsection B defines those terms. I won't go through those in detail unless you want me to, but basically all those terms are defined here. I think that the important one to highlight is number 7 on page 2, unmet need. That's the focus of this bill, which is the amount after a reasonable student contribution, and taking into account non-student loan, what's left over that's not being funded. And so that's part of the language we'll come on to in section 2. Section 2 on page 3 adds a new section of law on VSC and Vermont Students Assistance Corporation reporting. So it requires that by January of 24, and then by January 15th, annually thereafter, VSC and VSAC will submit a report to you containing the corporation's progress in attaining affordability for full-time students enrolled with the corporation for the first time. The corporation's progress in attaining affordability for all other students. The average and median amount of unmet need for full-time students enrolled with the corporation for the first time, and the average and median amount of unmet needs for all other students. The average median annual and cumulative student and parent debt by loan type for students obtaining a 2-year or 4-year degree. And then for students enrolled with the corporation, VSC, their average yearly continuation rate, academic progress, and graduation rate. Section 3 on page 4 of the bill requires that VSAC, in collaboration with AOE, submit a report to you on how to implement a requirement that all high school students complete the free application for federal student aid as a condition of graduation. Section 4 simply moves some text from another section into this subsection, so no substantive change there. And the section from which this moves is repealed in section 5. And section 6, as section law, requires that on or before July 1 of next year, VSC and VSAC should jointly recommend to you the definition of the affordability standard, which is a defined term that has to have more definition to it after further consideration. And the effective dates, 1 and 2 take effect July 1 next year. Those are the changes to the requirement around strategic goals and the requirement around reporting. They take effect next year, and then 3, 4, 5, and 6 take effect this year.
Senator Tomazzini.
Hey, Jim, good to see you.
Me too.
So I just read the bill, I listened to your report, and plainly speaking, I don't know what we're trying to accomplish here, to be honest with you. And what is the, I guess, the problem where we've identified, and what is this bill going to do?
I'm not sure if I can identify the problem for you, because that's more, I think, in the realm of policy or, but the bill's trying to do.
Strategic goals.
Good question.
So this came to us from the House. Representative James was in, took us through it. And this is really follow-up work as the state colleges continue to kind of come together and merge. And working specifically around priorities for budgeting and allocation of resources and questions of affordability. It's really giving them, correct me if I'm wrong here, Jim, some direction on figuring some of this out. As I recall, the most kind of controversial part of this bill, which I would say the House was trying to solve, was the report in section 3, which was saying that the Vermont State, that VSAC with AOE would submit a written report on whether and how to implement requiring all high school students to complete the FAFSA form. That was the part that I think maybe raised the most questions on whether or not that was a direction the committee and others wanted to go in, because we did have concerns. There are issues of, again, this is just a report, but we haven't taken these kinds of steps in the past. I know I raised that I think some states, perhaps Maine, but from what I could tell, they haven't done this either, requires, for high school graduation students to actually do a college application. There might be states that require that people fill out FAFSA, but it is a issue that normally the state doesn't involve itself in. And I think, again, committee, correct me if I'm wrong, that seemed to me the most controversial part of the bill. The others, and we have the state colleges here in the room as well. Catherine, did you remember weighing in with any concerns on anything in the bill? Or do you want to say a word now?
For the record, Catherine Lavasser, Director of External and Governmental Affairs for the Vermont State Colleges System. The goal with the bill was to establish some strategic goals, as Senator Campion mentioned, and reporting requirements for the system. There is not a lot in statute that establishes strategic priorities for higher education funding in any of the priority areas that the state has established. And so the goal here, and you will find that these are very in line with the priorities that were set by our board. Our board's strategic priorities are affordability, accessibility, quality of academic programs, and relevance of programs. Embedded in all 4 of those is an intentional focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. These goals for the state very closely mirror that prioritization that our board has set forth. In terms of the other pieces of the bill, there had been some recommendations in the select committee's report regarding establishing an affordability standard for the state, recognizing the cost of public higher education in Vermont and kind of where we are ranked nationally in our cost of attendance for students. We're on the more expensive end in all of our public institutions. And so one of the thoughts that the select committee had put forward when they were studying public higher education in Vermont and the Vermont State Colleges was the concept of establishing this affordability standard as a way for the state to measure progress. Once there's a standard in place, we can put forward data, but unless you are measuring the same data and the same components year to year, it's not always exactly comparable. And so the goal with the affordability standard was to accomplish that. They had also made some recommendations around FAFSA completion, which is why that's on the bill as well.
Can you give an example of what you think would be the affordability standard? Like, even though it says you have to come up and the bill would have you do it, or you and others do it, come back. But can you give an example of what it might be?
So for example, and we spent a lot of time meeting with VSAC to try to figure out what this might look like. And one of the reasons that we have more time is because we didn't quite land. But for example, out of pocket, like the difference between a Pell Grant and the expected family contribution. How much does a student have to take out in personal or Parent Plus loans in order to attend an institution?
How would you decide what an affordable amount?
And that's one of the questions that we really struggled with is what is the definition of affordability?
Right.
And what is to say, if you hit X target number or Y target number, what is affordable or not?
Mhm.
And so the group that the Joint Fiscal Office hired to work on the select committee report does a lot of work in this area and had made this recommendation that the state needs something to keep this conversation going and to keep it a policy priority. We're not quite there in the conversations with VSAC to figure out what it looks like. I imagine it's going to land somewhere in what is the student debt, what is the expected family contribution.
And then based on like the median income or something.
Exactly.
Okay.
So as a follow-up to that, Senator Hooker, no, you weren't on it. Sorry.
Senator Bruce was on the
I co-chaired a task force over the summer and fall on affordable, accessible healthcare. And one of the things that we did was to identify principles of affordability related to healthcare, but there are principles that might well inform the work for affordable college expenditures and tuition. So I really suggest, that when the definition I'm looking at, affordability standard, has the word affordability in it, it seems, like, I don't know how that definition happened, but I'm thinking that there might be a better way to define affordability and affordability standard, because then there's affordable, a level of financial commitment that results from application of affordability standards. So it's all kind of circular. This isn't about you, obviously, you didn't write this, but I'm thinking that moderates the rate of cost growth could be defined as a maximum % of income annually, in this case per person. So there are some principles that might be applied that could be helpful to understanding what an affordability standard is and accelerate the process. And then I also have principles associated with accessibility because we also it's related to healthcare, but obviously the principles are transferable to different places. And I'm as I look at this, I'm confused about which isn't hard to do, frankly, right now, but about the definitions that are here, how colleges look at affordability. It's always, of course, based on one's income and situation, but if it's broader than that, if we're looking at inflationary rates and growth of costs over broader areas. Just some thoughts.
Yeah, I think we can. I mean, you're largely talking about, or you're talking about a couple of things, but one of which is what does it mean to be affordable to a family, depending again on their income. And do you know if this has been done in other states or at other institutions? I mean, these conversations have to happen in financial aid offices all the time, or even sort of philosophically. I think about Bennington College. I mean, I know it's always people talk about the amount of debt that's acceptable to kind of graduate with. Ideally, it would be 0, but given circumstances out there, and financial needs that need to be met, can't meet all the needs. So what does that number look like?
I know that there has been some work that MCHS pointed to. I couldn't give you the exact state or the exact example, but
Okay, Ms. Koenig, do you want to identify yourself for the record?
Sure, Wendy Koenig, Director of Government Relations for UVM. There's a lot of work done on this at the federal level. I'm not familiar with what other states have done. I think Catherine's right that MCHS might know about state work, but there's a lot of tools and research that the federal government's done about affordability standards. Happy to put some things together for you to help you guys look at.
This is the kind of work that you would be digging into over the summer,
right.
using these resources. Yes, and first.
And does the state colleges and UVM support this? Like, do you think this is a good use of your time?
Yes, we've had 4 or 5 or 6 conversations with VSAC already about what this might look like and the structure of what it might look like, but we really have embraced the enhanced relationship with the state and really embraced the concept of having strategic goals and priorities for the system.
Do you think we should add a 5th goal that talks about quality that you mentioned was in your own goals?
So that has been, that was debated on the House side. Some members might say that there's just an expectation, you're meeting your accreditation standards, you are a quality program. And I don't think we would have objected, quality was in there. It's in alignment with our strategic priorities.
Because one of my, what I think was what Senator Terenzini was getting at, it's like the reporting seems like a report just to do a report.
Yeah.
And so,
That might not need legislative action.
yeah, or like that you would have this data, if we asked for it, but to do a report every year from now for the rest of the time. But you're saying you're welcoming the opportunity to do this report.
I think we always welcome the opportunity to communicate more about what we're doing with the state and would be fine producing a report. If you tell me you'd like to take that off my plate, I'm not going to sit here and object. But we do welcome the opportunity to share more information about what we're doing with the state.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but earlier on when we were taking through this, Representative James, I think, laid this out as a continuation of the strategic plan and the merging of the institutions. Like, this is an important piece of it. That is where this is really coming from.
So a lot of this language you'll find in Act 74 in the appropriations bill from last year that really set the state's role in the transformation process of the system and endorse the select committee's proposal. And so much of what you find in here is the same language and the same information. So in that way, it would be solidifying that work in statute.
Okay. And I don't know if Senator Chinden wants to add anything related to study of bicycles on roads and highways, but this would be a vehicle.
Now that you mentioned it.
I think to Senator Pertlick's point, it's
Here we go.
largely a report.
Right, no, it is.
And then, like you pointed out, the only part that's somewhat controversial or debatable is, in my mind, is the federal student aid as a requirement of graduation, which, I'm a little on the fence about, quite honestly. I mean, I want as many students every year to go to college.
Yeah.
I think it's critically important, but I also remember when I was in high school, that was the push was college. And then now we've seen, well, we need plumbers and electricians and carpenters and body shop people as well. And that's important, just as important as going to college.
Yeah.
So I don't know if I love that section, to be honest.
Yeah, because at the very least, I do think we have to give families an out, because again, this is private information. I mean, how would we even, and again, I know and we're looking at you, even though I know you're not VSAC, you just happen to be at the other end of the table. For you to get husband and wife get their private information, get kids to fill it out, produce it, then how are you gonna even check on that, I guess is kind of what I'm asking myself. I see, Ms. Koenig, did you want to add something?
I just would add that, you know, I don't have skin in this game on the FAFSA, but if you fill it out, it's not just for college. There are
Okay.
federal dollars that go for trade schools or technical schools, that can be used by FAFSA. So I don't think that it's just for traditional.
Right, so if you want to go BC Tech or you know,
Yeah.
or wherever, you're gonna be able to figure out how many dollars you might be able to access. Senator Bursch, what do you think about that?
I mean, it's just it's a study to say how should it be done and how would you do it? I mean, it's okay, we'd get back and they would say, this is how you would do it, and we could get, or maybe they'd come back and say, don't do it, because we figured out something else.
I mean, the other thing that I might want to add to it, if committee members were interested, is then could we also have them, back to Senator Terenzini's point, maybe people do fill out, I mean, is there a way to get them to fill out an application for somewhere? If it's the trades or, I don't know, Senator Hooker.
So I'm just thinking in those terms, you know, are there apprenticeship programs? Are there internships that, you know, maybe funded through VSAT that would require families filling out the form? So it's generally, you know, a more general thing than just going to college. And my other thought is when talking about accessibility, and affordability, and coupling those two things, how can we make financial support more accessible to these kids? You know, what has to be done, and do we need legislation to do that? I mean, is a bill necessary? I guess the question.
I don't know the mechanism of exactly how this works, but to the question about non-degree programs, there is the advancement grant at BSAC, and I don't know if they require the FAFSA. I know that there are some eligibility requirements around it, but that's a mechanism for accessing financial aid for non-degree programs. It's the advancement grant, and that could be an avenue. If the FAFSA is required, that could be an avenue too. Alternatives to degree programs.
So for me, right now, we will return to this, we'll vote it out next week, but the questions are, do we add a fifth quality, which I think Senator Bursch's point makes sense, perhaps define better some of these, you know, what the affordability standard is, and then the question is whether or not we do indeed want to get into the possibility of students filling out FAFSA forms, and I'm pretty, you know, agnostic on it, to be honest. But it's like Senator Bursch said, and maybe others, you know, they come back, they say, yeah, this is the best thing, this is a great thing to do. We have evidence from other states that gets more kids into some kind of programs. I'm just going to take legislative action to actually do it one way or the other. Senator Lyons, anything else from you?
I did send you the 2 documents,
Okay.
but they're not. They're healthcare.
And I do think this information that they're asking for around affordability is actually, I think it would be good for the legislature to take a look at, particularly as it relates to moving forward with appropriations for the state colleges.
We're doing quite a bit of reporting per the Act 74 requirements.
Yeah.
We're doing a lot of reporting on various factors about our financial enrollment and affordability health.
Okay.
But this, I think, would put some metrics around it so it is comparable year to year and institution to institution.
I do have one more
Yeah,
question for
please.
Catherine, which is important. Do you pronounce your last name the way the chair does, or the way
It's been,
some other people like pronounce it?
Very Americanized French, so Levasseur.
it's a great last name.
I kind of like the way. it's-
Levasseur.
Okay. Can you tell us just right now, on average, what is somebody from the state colleges graduating with in terms of debt? Average now?
Depends on where you go.
Yeah. Generally, after 4 years, you're finishing.
I can pull you some numbers
Would you
in
mind?
about 5 minutes.
Yeah, if you want to email them to Daphne, and she can email them to all of us.
I think the state colleges reported before to us in this committee what they thought their average state college student, not including.
Yeah. Some of our programs, like we talked about nursing yesterday,
Right.
$1,000 more expensive. A lot of our students in those programs are second degree seekers, and so they don't qualify for financial aid in the same way. So I just wanted to pull our data book and put a little something together for you.
Okay, you needn't move. Mind joining her this morning, and Daphne, I'm gonna take copies of 517, please. So this will, senators will recall that yesterday we were talking about H 517, which is now S104, S105. The added in general language for requirements and the date to vote. The two of you I had asked to have a conversation. This is, by the way, there's no new language in what I just put. This is the original bit. So we are still at a spot where I felt we needed to take some time after looking at some emails and hearing from different individuals, get a sense of what the two of you had talked about and where you're at. And we have our ledge counsel here as well. So the floor is yours.
I'll start. So Wendy Koenig for the University of Vermont. Thanks for having us in again today. So we've emailed back and forth with each other and with Jim quite a bit last night. And I think there's only two areas that we are suggesting a change. One is what we talked about yesterday in terms of.
Do you have a copy in front of you so you can tell us what page?
This is
Termination. of
page
residence.
3,
Okay.
line 1.
Mhm.
Where we are talking about the rate charged by MVU.
Mhm.
And we had suggested some different language that we have in with Jim. I can read it out if that's helpful.
Please.
So for courses at any Vermont State College institution or the University of Vermont, the benefit shall be the in-state residence tuition for the relevant institution. And then there's a sub 2 for courses at any eligible Vermont private post-secondary institution. The benefit shall be the in-state tuition rate charged by UVM.
So wait, what do you mean by the private institutions?
So they are eligible. Anybody in here can go to a private as well as UVM with Vermont State Colleges.
With that, using that tuition marker. Got it.
Mhm.
Right.
And
And that is current law.
so we pulled this from current
Current
law.
law,
right.
We've changed it slightly.
And we were trying to match current law with what is proposed in the draft here. And so the pieces that we're talking about, 1, 2, and 3, this is the current law that has that oddity that we talked about yesterday, where the Castleton tuition isn't included, but all the other state colleges are.
Yeah.
So the piece that Wendy just read, by tying it to just Vermont State Colleges tuition, once we go through the unification, in a year, I won't have to come back
You'll come
and
And
back.
change
say,
it.
It's fine.
could you change it?
Yeah.
The underlying law also has this piece about the private post-secondary institutions. Current law has that tied to the Northern Vermont University rate.
Okay.
And so we're proposing that it be tied to the University of Vermont because that's the remaining entity.
But wouldn't you be making more money?
So there is a difference in tuition between NVU and UVM, so there is a financial cost there to the state.
What's the difference?
$200 credit out.
$200 per
Credit.
credit.
But when NVU ceases to exist in a year, the state's going to need something to tie the private institution tuition dollars to. And so without knowing, NVU won't exist without knowing what Vermont State University tuition is.
Still making it more expensive for people, more expensive for the state.
So one piece of this, I did a little bit of research last night because you remember that, and let me
walk back one step and preface this by saying, I'm really, really supportive of this bill. I think it's super duper important. It's been really helpful for the students that use it to attend UVM and the Vermont State Colleges. My worry a little bit with the sort of ambiguity about the funding was that it would be very disappointing to make a promise to people and then not have the money available for them to access the programs, especially for our active duty military folks.
Just 1 second. Jim, did you want to jump in here?
I didn't want to interrupt. I just wanted to get further context, if I could. The context, the question I have is, when do you refer to the top of page 3 in the reference to MVU, the new language is only clarifying that you can get more than one certificate under the program. And the number you can get is basically up to the 4-year, the cost of a 4-year degree at NVU. So wherever that amount is, you can get that many certificates. I think what Wendy and Catherine are raising is a more broad question, not just about that provision, but around the tuition more generally for the program, which is not in your bill because it's not being changed. So you're not even seeing that language. So I'm just trying to understand from Wendy and Catherine whether they're just talking about that one narrow area of the certificate, or they're talking about the whole tuition rates for the whole program.
I'd love to answer that. From my perspective, I would love to have the fixed fee for both the underlying statute and for this new proposal, because if we don't fix it now, I'm going to have to come back in a year and say, we need this fixed because there's no more NPU. And so while we have this section of
fix being the UVM in-state tuition,
the fix being changing the reference to any Vermont State College institution, and then for private institutions tying it to UVM rather than NVU. And so I think you would need a new section saying, correcting this section of the bill, as well as this piece at the top of page 3.
Jim?
Yeah, I was just trying to get context. That's fine. Just trying to understand what we're talking about.
So would you tell us what's happening right now with this, and maybe, and I'm just getting lost in some of the tuition. Tell me what's happening right now and then what you want to end up doing.
So what I found
In
out.
current law.
Yep, so what I found out yesterday is that even with the use of this National Guard scholarship tuition program now, there's a surplus every year. They're not spending all the dollars.
Okay.
So part of the worry that I was thinking about with master's programs and these other things is that they would run out of money, but that isn't happening currently.
Okay.
And I think because there's a 2-year pilot on this, we'll see in that 2 years what the uptake is. If there's real, if we get tons of interest in doing a second baccalaureate degree or a master's degree, then we can talk about, do we need more money in the overall program? How do we accomplish that, et cetera. I think right now, what we're trying to fix jointly is taking NVU out of the tuition equation, because NVU is about to cease to exist.
It just seems like, in a way, you guys are getting, and I know it's not your intention, but it's just from where I'm sitting, you guys are going to get a little bit more money over the next few years, because you're going to take it out of the National Guard fund, which already exists, but the tuition is, you're kind of getting an increase in tuition. Senator Perczyk's going to help me with this.
Well, I'm wondering what the existing tuition is based on.
In current law, it says that you can, for students wanting to attend a program at UVM or a private college, no. At UVM, they get the UVM rate. At a private college or the other state colleges, they get the NVU rate.
Say that again. So at the privates.
Jim is trying to wait.
Jim?
Not quite.
Well, I have the statute here, and you don't have it in your bill because it's not being amended. So let me just go through, if I could, what the statute says now and what I believe the changes that are being requested are. So the tuition benefit for courses at either campus of Northern Vermont University, the Vermont Technical College, UVM, or CCB, and those, the benefit shall be the in-state resident tuition rate for the relevant institution. I believe that is unchanged under Catherine's and Wendy's proposal. True? No?
No.
Not quite, sorry, Jim, this as written excludes the last state college, which is Castleton.
Oh,
That's it. Sorry, I'm getting there. That's the number 2. I'm not quite there yet. So the next one says, for courses at a Vermont State College other than MVU, VTC, or CCV, so Castleton. So for courses at Castleton or any eligible Vermont private college, the benefit shall be the in-state tuition charged by MVU. I believe that's where you want your change to say not to put Castleton up with the other Vermont State colleges so they get whatever they charge for in-state tuition. And I believe for this one here, you want the benefit for private institutions to be at the UVM in-state rate.
Very close. The challenging component of this is that because we will be having Vermont Tech, Northern Vermont University in Castleton, July 1, 2023, because there'll be one university, my request would be that the language be for courses at any Vermont State College institution. So that would cover CCV and the future Vermont State University, and for the next year, it would cover all of the Vermont State colleges.
And then you come back next year with
Right.
$1 amount that would.
Right. What we are there was a question a moment ago about what we are currently doing. Castleton currently provides an institution scholarship that covers the difference between the NVU rate and tuition. For most of the programs, it's $10 a credit, but for nursing, it's like $150 a credit, and so it's quite a bit more if a National Guard student would be enrolled in the nursing program. And so what this would do is it would basically pull that scholarship off of the institution and put Castleton equitable with the other in-state colleges.
So are you guys proposing that the new tuition benefit of these Guard members is the in-state rate of the institution they'll be attending, or UVM in-state for all, regardless of what they're attending?
The in-state rate if they're at an in-state college,
Yeah.
and the UVM rate if they are at a private college,
Why would we do that?
because it currently is tied to the NVU rate.
Why not just say this average, the state college rate?
Because we are currently undergoing, so we currently have, for example, if you look at Vermont Tech's programs, we have 10 different tuition rates, depending if you're in nursing, dental hygiene, respiratory therapy, aviation. And so one of the questions that we're tackling is for Vermont State University, are we going to have one tuition, or are we going to continue to have programmatic tuition, which is what we currently do? The question would be, what is that average? Is it the average of Vermont State and
We have
CCBs?
one undergraduate tuition.
You don't have those undergraduate programs that state colleges have.
No, we do have some of them, but we choose to have one undergraduate tuition rate. We start having variable tuition rates when we get into master's and professional programs.
So this would, again, you're now going to take a class, you're doing the in-state, you're doing a CCV, in-state for CCV, in-state for whatever it is for VT Tech, which again could be, nursing is going to be different than aviation. State colleges as well, in-state. Next year, you're going to come back and you're going to say, you may come back and say, we're moving to a one tuition for all of these, no matter if you take an aviation class or a nursing class or a math class.
It's just not
It's
decided.
right, it's just, that's why, right, you did that.
So it was an effort to simplify.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, this is simpler, right?
In an effort to support the bill, tied to UVM seems simpler than trying to talk to the state colleges.
Okay,
And I mean, UVM wouldn't be receiving any additional money because we are currently being reimbursed at our in-state rate.
Do you know how much is in this National Guard Fund?
1.319 million.
Do you know how much is left over every year?
I don't.
That's the annual appropriation. It hasn't been recently.
Okay. Yeah, would you mind finding that out?
Sure.
Okay, I'd be curious, because, we want it used.
Right.
Maybe we're not marking, yeah,
And
maybe
there
we
is-
even have to put more, and-
Representative Fagan, who was the original sponsor of this bill,
Yeah.
and I talked yesterday and today, and he says that there is a surplus, there's been a surplus each year. He didn't remember what it was, but we can find out. We can go to jail.
Maybe we do.
Okay, so Jim, is that clear?
Yeah, there's a third piece, though. So there are 3 different tuition sections or provisions. We went through the first 2. The third
Yeah.
one is for getting a non-degree, so a certificate training.
Yeah.
Current law says that the benefit shall be the lower of the institution's standard tuition or the in-state rate charged by MVU. I believe the proposal is to say the lower of the institution's standard tuition or the in-state tuition rate charged by UVM.
Same thing for clarity, because MV won't exist, starting in about a year.
Okay, I think that new proposal makes sense, Jim, unless you have questions about it.
Nope, just wanted the clarification. That's great.
Okay. Thank you. Anything else?
I'd be happy to look at a draft or whatever is
Sure.
helpful.
Oh, yeah,
We
yeah,
can
thank you.
certainly do that.
We'll have you both in tomorrow, because we just want to wrap this up. I mean, all of these things. So, Jim, if you don't mind having another draft that you could share with Ms. Koenig and Ms. Lavasseur, that would be great. And then we'll have them in tomorrow we'll have another little walkthrough and just make sure we're all on the
Yeah,
same page.
great.
Yes.
Sure.
Question about a different section of the bill.
Okay.
And that was the spouse or dependent child benefit.
Mm-hmm.
And,
Page.
I see it on page 5.
Okay.
It's under the determination of residency for tuition purposes. It's the section C, line 10. In this section, is the intention for the benefit for the spouse or child to be available for somebody who is, for example, currently enrolled in a program or about to enroll in a program? Or is the intention of this section for the benefit to be available to that spouse or dependent indefinitely? And it's just a question that our general counsel had when she reviewed the bill. Because she felt like it wasn't 100% clear and wanted to know for her purposes. And so I just wanted to ask this committee that.
Jim?
Well, so my reading of this is that it's not time limited. It is available to a spouse or dependent child of a member of the U.S. Armed Forces stationed in the state pursuant to military order. So I think if this passes, then dependents and spouses of currently stationed people and the future people who are stationed here would take advantage of this benefit. And it would go on for an indefinite period.
Because the last line
Yes.
says,
Is
is thereafter transferred on military order or retires. So if you have someone who's here and has a baby, and then they're transferred to another state or they retire, are we saying that
18 years old.
when they're 18, it ends? I mean, we're just trying to figure out what the time horizon is on that.
Jim, what's the intention of that section C?
The intention of this is to allow spouses and dependent children of the military not to have to wait a year to get in-state tuition. So they're eligible for in-state tuition at the start of the next semester after the military person has been moved to Vermont. So I believe that's the intention.
Yeah, I think it's a good point that they raised that. I think that the goal of that second sentence is that if their family is still here,
Mhm.
but the member of the military gets transferred, but they're still here,
Then it's
just
okay.
because the military member is transferred, they don't lose the in-state. Or I'm no longer, I still live in Colchester, but I retired, so, but my dependent loses the
Right.
in-state tuition. But I think if the way it reads,
Yeah.
your example would hold that.
Yeah.
I was born here 10 years ago. I just moved back by
Yeah.
myself. My dad, who's in the military, still lives in Louisiana, but I get free in-state tuition in Vermont because my dad lived here for.
Because
Yeah, that was,
That's the way
it
I
was
read
just
it,
a little confusing.
Yeah.
I would
And
think
and
we
that's
want.
not the intention.
No.
Yeah. Would you mind correcting that, Jim?
So what do you want to say, in terms of like,
What we don't, I can tell you what we don't want to have happen is the example that was just given where, you leave when you're 2, you go away, your mom, who was a colonel, might be retired in Florida, and you just decide to come back to Vermont, that all of a sudden you're gonna get that in-state tuition right away. We really want it for when people are
Here.
here.
So you just could say that if the member thereafter is transferred, but the spouse and dependent child are still living in the state.
Right,
Just some
Right, because they can
qualification,
leave,
yeah.
right? We
Yeah.
want, they're gonna leave.
Because if they left and came back, then it would apply again. They would still get
Yeah,
in-state.
in-state.
So
Yeah. But by that time of year would be up.
Is that the intent, if they leave and come back again?
as long as they're here, I think is what we're saying. So
Right.
As long as the
military
military person is, as long as that's maybe the cleanest way to say it. As long as the military person is here, then the
Or the
benefit,
residents sit here. They might be transferred to Germany for a year, but
right,
they
but the
remain
resident,
here.
right, and their spouse is
Right.
here. Does that make sense, Jim?
yeah, so as long as the spouse or the dependent taking advantage of this is in Vermont, they get this benefit.
And it kind of stayed in Vermont since when it started.
Yeah.
So they can't come back, they can't leave for 20 years, come back and say,
Stuck in
"No,
Vermont.
stuck in Vermont. The only way.
So
I do think that in the,
Does that make sense, Jim?
It does. I'm trying to figure out how to write that, but that's not a problem.
Yeah, right.
Okay,
So
is that,
once that student has the established residency and is in a program,
Yeah.
that's fine, but that student goes away for a while and then comes back and is not the military person. But you're saying as long as the military person is still here,
as long as they're parent?
as long as the parent is still here, so
Or
at
spouse.
what age does that student then
dependent child.
until 18? Is that
Spouse or
dependent
child.
It doesn't say until 18.
No.
Well, this is
doesn't-
this is for the colleges though, so it's not 18, it would be, it's
Right.
college level.
But it's a dependent child, so a 30 year
Right,
old
thank you.
child probably wouldn't be a dependent.
A dependent child, right.
Depends on the family.
Yeah, it could be a,
My kids are
we hear a lot about Senator Butchers.
I do think that in the written testimony I gave you about S-104, I think the Higher Ed Education Act already covers this. I mean, I think that there's already federal law that states that if you receive a transfer and you have a dependent who's already attending, that they are able to stay at that
and
institution.
finish the
Yeah, I think that federal law already covers it, so I don't know that this section is necessary, but if we want to amend it so that it's just clear, that would
Yeah.
be great.
Okay, how's that sound, Jim?
Fine, yeah.
Okay. I'll tell you, Jim is amazing. Jim, you're amazing.
We'll see.
Very proven.
We'll see.
Okay,
Thank you.
yeah, sure.
Thanks.
Thank you. We'll see you tomorrow so we can finish this up. Okay. Okay. 7:16. Daphne, you have copy. Thank you. Okay, so 716, we've talked about, this is the House Miscellaneous Education Bill. Thank you. We've asked, I've been sort of playing with this a little bit, and just thought we would have the secretary in. We've talked about the rule delay. We've talked a little bit about civic education, Holocaust studies, etc. I'm just so you know, I'm not pleased with section 3 yet, but it just put something on paper. And then section 4, crime insurance coverage. And then we have section 5, education workforce development. So let's just go through. Mr. Secretary, thanks for joining us.
Good afternoon.
As you know, I'm sure you've been in House Ed and other committees. We're trying to finish our work. We've been working closely with our friends in House Senate Appropriation and Senate Finance on some funding things, and we're getting to the point where we just have some outstanding questions that I'm hoping you might be able to help us with. And I'm going to jump around a little bit. Well, actually, I'll start with the rule delay. We have heard from a lot of people on both sides of this issue. Parents, in particular, that do not want the delay. We heard from a psychologist yesterday. We've heard from a number of I'd say our advocacy groups for superintendents, teachers, et cetera, that really want the delay. We did hear yesterday from one psychologist that said in a survey that was done, roughly 94% of those that would implement this are not ready to implement it. I should also say your agency's been very helpful with giving us a sense of what the training looks like. But, I'll be honest, I think the committee is still trying to figure out what we should do on this. So we thought we'd bring the colonel in to help us with some of these things. And we may demote you after we hear testimony on other sections, but for now, you're the colonel.
Well, thank you. Good afternoon. Dan French, for the record, Secretary of Education. I'd be happy to demote it, promote it. Honestly, I just don't feel it anymore. But anyway, I can be helpful to you and particularly helpful to you going home. I'm really happy to contribute. Anyway, I've submitted some written testimony, but I'll just follow your lead, Mr. Chair. And so on the delay, I think you did a fair job of describing the dynamics. I mean, honestly, to a large extent, you could apply those dynamics to any education policy. We've seen, I think in my first year as secretary, I think I was known as the champion of delay because every time I was coming in, I was asking for a delay of this and a delay of that. Honestly, this is quite simple for me as secretary because I don't think anyone has come in and said this is bad policy for kids. And honestly, that's where I come down on it is I don't think we can delay policy that's good for kids. And yes, it's going to be challenging to implement. We're committed to providing that support, but I don't know if it's appropriate to not leverage the oversight function of regulation to get the right thing done for kids. And that's ultimately what will compel people to get in alignment to enact this. So I don't, and I've listened to the testimony on this. I'm a part of the Secretary's Advisory Group in special education, so I understand the dynamics. But I just simply conclude I want to err on the side of doing what's right for kids and doing that sooner rather than later.
Any questions? Senator Persnick.
So just to reiterate that, Secretary French, you've heard the testimony from the school psychologists and the others that have said that implementing it when they're not totally ready will cause problems for them. You think it's still better to go forward with the rule on July 1st, even if there's some difficulty with those schools trying to figure out how to do the adverse assessment and things like that?
Yes, I think so. I don't think it's that clean of a linear process, like everyone's fully tooled up to implement it and then we go forward. Evaluations will come up periodically, every 3 years, evaluations are triggered. Some kids will come up sooner than that and they'll work through that. In particular, my written testimony, I reacted to some, I think what I kind of characterized as compromise language around a waiver process. I did not find that attractive. I think the first part of it was to give it the waiver function to schools. I think that's technically inaccurate, firstly, because special ed is administered now at the supervisory union level. So I think it would be problematic. I don't think you intended to give waiver authority to individual schools. I think that would be really challenging in a school district system that's now responsible for special education with Act 153 and Act 156. I also think it's problematic, even if you did put a waiver authority at the school district level, I think it's problematic to implement it. Kids do move across system boundaries quite regularly during the school year. And I think it would be challenging to have different special education rules essentially in one district versus another if the students were to transition between the two systems. If you are interested in going down that path, regardless, I also comment that I think the language by which I would approve or deny such a waiver request is too loose and a little vague and doesn't really give the agency adequate criteria to deny such a request, particularly if it's in the best interest of students. So I would, I would just conclude, I think it's complex for sure, fairly simple. And from my perspective is let's just move forward on what's best for kids, and the system will work its way towards being proficient in implementing the new regulations.
Senator Bursley.
So I found that language in the bill. I remember we talked about it, but I didn't know we had language. Is that stuff that we added?
I think this is what he thought.
1 second.
That's what that was sent to me last night by the committee.
This,
So
Beth?
Page 3, line 6.
Yeah, this is Beth's language that she took out of, I believe, the House bill. This is, this is H716.
This was language.
This should be the language, and I don't think she would have changed it. Not at my request, and I don't think anybody in the room request. Maybe she highlighted the whole thing, but I'm not
But
sure.
if you look, this is not in the current bill.
Yeah, this is all new.
This is all new.
Yeah.
And so this was a question I was gonna ask the colonel, but I would say general, but anyway. The language that's here has the agency granting an extension, provided that information is provided. But you brought up a really good issue that if it's going to be at the supervisory union level for each of the special educators who are in charge, what kind of pressure is that going to put on those individuals to work with each of the schools? And suppose all the schools decided in a district that they wanted to have an extension. Would that be a district-wide extension then? Or would it have to be done school by school? What would you see happening there?
Yeah, my first point in that is I don't see how it could be done on a school by school basis, because schools don't have special education staff anymore. All special education staff were required to become supervisory employees under Act 156 of 2012. So I think it would be problematic just on an administrative basis, even if that were the case where schools were able to do that. I think it would be exceedingly challenging to administer centrally if you had schools with different sets of rules, and I think that you'd really run into some issues, due process and otherwise, to administer the program that way.
So I apologize, Mr. Secretary, and to the committee as well. I believe what we're looking at now is possible language. We could move in one direction or the other, and our ledge counsel did not just take it upon herself. I'm sure I said, hey, what would some compromised language look like? So that is what we're looking at now. But we do have the original language that the House sent over, and
that was just a straight delay.
And that was just a straight delay. And as the Secretary is saying, no delay from his standpoint is necessary.
That would be my preference.
And just by chance, does the agency have authority to do a waiver if you wanted to? So like if you had one certain school that lost all their special education teachers for some reason, and they asked for a waiver, could it be granted, or would that not be allowed even if you wanted to?
I'd have to take that back to our legal team to evaluate. I think, these are regulations of the state board. There are some general waiver provisions that apply to all regulations, and then there are specific waiver provisions. I'd have to have our legal counsel evaluate that. I don't, again, with this type of program, I don't think it's desirable to have not every school district in the state operating under the same regulations.
Senator Chittenden.
Do we not run that risk though, even if we don't do the delay and we ask all the school districts that have 94% of the 51 of them said that they're not ready for this, that they might still fumble with the rollout, as we were cautioned yesterday. So it is entirely possible, even without the delay, that this won't be a smooth and consistent rollout. Would you concede that point?
Yeah, I would agree. As we found in Act 46, which is passed in 2015, and then the Secretary of State plan that came online before I was secretary in 2017. And then as we got further into that process with the state board in 2018, we still found districts that had not centralized special education under a law that was passed in 2012. And that's law, not regulation. So, again, what you describe is a fair characterization of any policy in our decentralized education system, not just this one. And I would expect if this is decided on an issue of perception of readiness, that immediately I would receive waiver requests from every single one of those districts.
Yes.
And I wouldn't necessarily have the criteria to deny them, because the criteria that was in the draft language that I saw is basically, is it reasonable and did they fill out the form correctly?
Right. So I don't know if I'm representative of the majority in this committee, but I'm much more by the statement you just made and the testimony from Chair Webb and from the individuals on the ground working with these rules, just asking for one more year to get this right. And being married to a teacher, as well as hearing from others in my district that are very close to this issue, I'm still of the mind that the delay makes sense. And I would wonder, I know you've expressed caution, but if the delay were to be in place, and a school district chose to go early, that is a major concern to you, that you would not want school districts to choose to go early if we allowed a full year delay?
I think that makes it much harder to administer the system. And I think it's going to make it harder. When I say administer the system, special education is a fairly complex program to administer from the local level up through the state level. There's several layers of appeal and due process and so forth. I think it's going to be adds layer of complexity that's not necessary at this moment in time.
Thank you. Secretary French, my concern is that we've heard from teachers who have said they haven't heard anything about this yet. And they're going to roll it out without them having any indication of what's expected of them and, the kind of support that they're going to get. Will the agency give the support to these schools that need it? There are those, as Senator Chittenden just pointed out, that are ready to go, and there are those who have no idea what's coming down the pipe. So what kind of support will there be, and how would that intersect with starting the process, keeping on track with the process and developing it as you go? I mean, it sounds to me as if there are going to be teachers who have no idea what their role is in this new paradigm.
Yeah, I think it's a fair question, but again, it's firstly, these rules have been under development for several years, so the broader education community has been exceedingly involved in the rule development through the advisory group and other interfacing with the formal organizational structures. You talked about teachers having a certain perception, and then you shifted to schools having a certain perception. I'm not surprised that individual teachers aren't aware, or to what extent they are aware. I think, again, that could be, you could characterize any policy in the state in that regard. For me, the question is, to what extent are the special ed directors, school psychologists, the core central office staff that administer the provisions that are really in question, to what extent are they ready to do it? It is a technical shift. We have, and I think you've heard testimony previously, we've been rolling out that support to people, and we'll continue to do it, certainly accelerate that between now and July 1. But I don't expect every teacher in my, to Senator Chittenden's question, I'm married to a teacher as well. We make it a point of not talking about these things at home. but I'm sure she's woefully aware of the implications of Act 173 regulatory change.
Sounds like a good policy, Secretary French.
Yeah, it's enabled us to stay married for 30 some odd years.
Okay, so we have a decision to be made in this committee. Of course, this is a miscellaneous education bill from the House. Appreciate you weighing in. I do really appreciate the agency saying that, okay, you guys are, gals are ready to move on this. That does mean a lot. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Can I ask one more question?
Please.
Just a really brief question. There are pros and cons on each side of this, and we keep hearing about those, but what we haven't heard about is the liability with one decision or another. And from your perspective, what are the risks associated on either side? And when I say liability, I do mean legal responsibility and consequences.
Yeah, and I think it's a great question. It goes to the sort of the heart of the issue of whether a piecemeal delay, in my view, is a prudent one, because I think it's all or nothing. Essentially, I would strongly encourage you from a liability standpoint or a due process standpoint to either enact the rules in time or to delay them across the board. To have it done piecemeal, I think, opens up the system to greater liability. It is rightfully an area where there is liability because these children are eligible for specific services and entitled to those services. So again, for me, in spite of this complexity, you're talking about delaying a child's entitlement to services, and I don't think that's an acceptable disposition. Yes, it's a complex change. We've been through other complex changes. We need a go live date to enact those.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator, Secretary French, we have been grappling a little bit in this committee with a number of different issues, and we're trying to find a path forward. And I know you emailed me some information, and I appreciate in section 3 you mentioned that even a brief report from the agency on these issues would be more than acceptable. But I think we have to, if we're one of the sort of must-pass issues related to this body, and I believe I'm talking from the corner office as well, since the Pro Tem was a co-sponsor of this bill, and Senator Terenzini has raised the issue, is we're looking at issues related, as we've talked in this committee with Jessica Careless and others, of Holocaust studies, civic education, how to teach January 6th, how with the attack on LGBTQ students happening, not in this state, but we know in Florida, or we also have, yes, there's also evidence, I see some head nodding, that there have been some concerns around what's happening in this state as well. And also, just generally, how are we talking and teaching about these kinds of things? And so I'm just saying we need something. And I know that you are also, I immensely trust you as being our partner on these issues. There's no question about that. But I'm trying to find some language. We're trying to find a way to move forward where next year we could get started and have a conversation around how are these things being taught? What are some of the best practices in classrooms? What are some of the things that the agency is doing around these kinds of issues? So that's where we're at, and we can continue to work on language, and we'll put it in, and we appreciate your willingness to do a report on wherever we land. But it's every time, and this in some ways, of course, isn't new, but this, there are all sorts of issues that we work with young people and try to equip teachers to teach these things. But I hope this gives you some of the ideas that we're grappling with. And you've been great at helping us find solutions in other areas. So wondering your thoughts on how we might most effectively move forward and work with all of you.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the committee wrestling with this topic. I mean, every legislature around the country is working through these issues at the moment, I think,
right,
probably more so than ever. I would say by way of introduction, I was a high school social studies teacher, so these topics are close to my heart. When I became a principal, one of the things you realize when you move from being a teacher to principal is that you have to work through people. You're not teaching the kids yourself necessarily, but certainly as a principal, when you're talking about issues of civics and democracy, part of the design of schooling is to have kids try those things on, like through committees, task force, student representatives to boards. So the students observe democracy in action through the schoolhouse, and the principals have a critical role in that. But you shift from being a teacher to being a principal, and you have to think about, well, how do I support those social studies teachers doing that? And then when you move from principal to being superintendent, then you're talking about sort of systems level change. And in our construct in Vermont, curriculum is a supervisory union responsibility. So as a superintendent, then I'm charged with working with a curriculum director, curriculum coordination, curriculum committees of staff to develop the curriculum and to ensure that's enacted across all our schools. And then when you move to the state level, you have to move into sort of the policy realm, and that gets us into law and regulation. This is a long-winded introduction. I appreciate your patience, but in Vermont, our construct is the state board adopts standards, curriculum standards, and then locals are responsible under the law for creating curriculum that's aligned to those standards. So that's the current construct. I weighed in, just as a sort of a case study on this topic, I weighed in as secretary a bit with the Springfield School District on the CRT debate.
Right.
They were facing a resolution that one board member was promoting, basically prohibiting the teaching of CRT. I didn't want to influence their decision per se, but I pointed out to them that school boards are required to have policies in Vermont, and this predates our current moment in time. But our school boards have policies in place that allow them to deal with these local types of responses and teaching of controversial issues, evaluating curriculum, and so forth. They're required to have policies that give them some sort of guidance on how to address the issue, very similar to the mascot conversation, right? So my point to the letter, I don't know if you saw my letter to the Springfield School Board, is like, you have some tools. Actually, Springfield, I thought, had an exemplary construct for those tools. They had all the policies they should have had, and they had the tools already in their toolkit. If there were concerns in the community about curriculum a certain way, they had a vehicle to analyze that and evaluate it. And it rightfully shifted responsibility to administration to prove that. So thinking about the larger construct at the state level, my first question and sort of comment would be, to what extent do we want to change the construct that we have? Is it in every generation, every legislature has to re-examine these things, but our construct that has served us up to this moment is the state's role is promulgating standards, and then locals develop curriculum. Now, we did make a shift in 2010. We shifted curriculum from a school responsibility to the supervisory union or district level responsibility. But is that construct satisfactory when we have moments like this appear? Is this something where the state then feels, we're not comfortable with that? We want more direction, and this is where, in the past we've had issues where the legislature might direct the state board to adopt standards in specific areas, for example, or to spur some oversight on the part of the agency, which I think is essentially what you're contemplating here with the study. Spur some oversight or support on the part of the agency to delve into a specific curriculum area. So, I mean, I just sort of lay that construct out for you. I think, where I noticed that sort of a national pattern now, and I think Vermont will always have an element of local control. So shall we say, some states require curriculum from the state on down. I don't think that would fit our culture per se. But I think there's an initiative emerging in many sort of rural states that have local control of curriculum. And there's a middle ground, which is the idea of high quality instructional materials. So the state would promulgate standards, but also then have regulation around requirement of high quality instructional materials. And there's some ways to evaluate that and describe what that would mean. So that provides another level of assurance that certain things are being taught, or at least the right materials are being used, so to speak. Literacy reform is an example where states have become increasingly interested in ensuring that science-based literacy materials are being adopted by school districts. So, I mean, anything's possible in that realm. Certainly, I think the issue of civics and civics education should be and is central to social studies education. But as I said, a former social studies teacher myself, I can tell you the social studies curriculum is not especially well articulated. You know, it came from the 1970s when we had sort of social sciences were emerging, sociology, economics, political science, and that sort of moment in time intellectually was to divide social sciences into discrete areas of study. And history doesn't really fit into that. History is not necessarily a social science. Some of my historians would disagree. But so what we see in the K-12 curriculum is a hodgepodge mix of those things. And, you know, at the high school level, civics, to what extent civics is taught or not taught, where I taught in New Hampshire, it was a requirement. Civics was a requirement for high school graduation. But New Hampshire also required economics as a graduation requirement, you know. So you could also get into the space of graduation requirements, and that would get into course requirements and so forth. So there's several different areas to go in. So again, I would suggest that if this is a policy priority for you and for our state, then you would task us to find a way to situate that priority somehow in the construct that either one exists now or would lead us to a conversation of fundamentally changing the construct, meaning that the state would have a larger role in curriculum and insisting on what the graduation requirements would be.
Thank you, Secretary French, for your explanation. And I certainly appreciate the local control and influence that our schools have currently. Is it fair to say that if a school, for example, a high school, didn't teach algebra or biology, is it fair to say that your agency would have something to say about that or a problem with that?
Yeah, I mean, the answer is we should. Whether we do or not, it's another thing altogether. And this gets to a conversation that we're, you know, heating up on the revision to the education quality standards and the oversight of those quality standards. We do not necessarily evaluate schools on specific graduation requirements. There are in our education quality standards now, that would be a good place for the committee to start, is to review those quality standards. To what extent they're explicit enough or not. And this is where you could give direction as a General Assembly. If you were dissatisfied with what's described there, you could give the state board or the agency some direction on getting more explicit. But to use your specific example, we have life science described in our state quality standards, but there's no quality assurance process by which the agency would evaluate to what extent a school is teaching that. And schools would have the ability to either offer a discrete course of that or organize that content in some other combination of courses. For example, biology might be incorporated into a course called sustainability and life sciences or something like that. So, you know, locals have the ability to embed those proficiencies in different organization of courses.
I would just say as a follow-up, I appreciate your response to my question, but you know, previously before you were here half hour ago or whatever, we were talking with UVM and the Vermont State College System that we might require before a high schooler graduates that every high schooler has to fill out a federal aid form to see what they will qualify for higher education. And I just think, you know, if we're going to discuss and consider that as a requirement, then we should discuss and consider Holocaust and civics education to our students as part of a high school graduation requirement, and so on. I remember back, I needed 3 gym classes before I could graduate. So I think there's ways that we can go about it. And I understand what you're saying about more of a localized influence, but, you know, I'm horrified when I see what's going on in the world today. And I think all of us are in the room. And I think that we have a big platform to help influence that. When I see that there are a very small percentage of people, but you hear things that people actually support what Vladimir Putin is doing right now, and things of that nature just make me sick to my stomach to think. And if we could influence the next generation and teach them civics and what caused the Holocaust and so on, I think we're a better state and country for it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with you on any of those points. And when I say I'm not enamored with the system we have. Actually, you'll find me to be a very active partner in improving the quality of our standards and our regulation. Just to give you an example, when it was a shock to me when I came from New Hampshire to Vermont in 1992. I crossed the river in the same geographic area and became a principal of a Vermont school. The graduation requirements in math and science in Vermont for high school were five credits either or. So you could graduate high school in Vermont without taking any science at all. You know, and that was a function of our own state standards and a description of how these content areas were going to come together over time and so forth. I mean, I consider, you know, I was open to the idea, but I'm a fairly traditional person in that regard. And I immediately scrambled to put some basic curriculum building blocks in place. But then I found out I was not alone in doing that. You know, I can remember being brought to a conversation of other K-12 principals by the then Deputy Secretary or Deputy Commissioner of Education, Marge Pettit. And she's like, you know, we're worried about the quality of these standards. Are you in K-12 principals? Do you guys see this? Because you're in charge of the whole thing. And we're all like struggling with the same problem. And I thought I was just being like the new guy from another state that was like, well, maybe it's just me. But, you know, we've come a long way since then. But I think, you know, the issues of quality in our regulation and our oversight need to be addressed and need to be addressed sooner rather than later. And I think that gets at the facilities issues, at the weighting issues. All this is the work in front of us as an education system right now. It's not an issue. The good news is it's not an issue of not having a talented workforce to do it. It's a function of regulation and organization of our schools. And that can be improved fairly quickly. But we have to have some urgency to do it.
Can you help us a little bit, or your agency, just get us some language to kick this kind of conversation off? Recognizing we know everybody's time is tight, not only now, but also in the summer. But I think you're hearing that we'd like to, we don't want anybody to do something that's not going to lead to a productive, informative session next year. But it sounds like there's some confluence here, and any language you might be able to help us put into statute would be helpful.
Yeah, I would suggest we did some work in House Ed relative to the evaluation of the weighting study. I think it's section 14, where we inserted some language around development of school district quality standards. And I think what I saw yesterday was a expression of the state board basically to engage more deeply in the education quality standards. I would insert something there that said include an examination of to what extent civics standards and Holocaust education standards should be included in that review.
Okay.
Yeah, it kind of gets you into that more specific sort of direction.
Yeah.
And I think the issue of education quality standards is likely to be open soon because of the Act One Ethnic Studies group. They're about to bring forward some recommendations. I think the state board is queued up. They formed a subcommittee to open that. So the time is ripe to put that on the table.
Is that enough for you, Ms. St. James?
The weighting study bill is not mine, so I'm not familiar with that section, but it's easy to look up.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, so we'll work with Ms. James on some of that language. Okay, thank you. A couple more items. I'm going to just step out to use the bathroom, but because usually we have a bathroom break, but we're going to keep going. If anybody else needs to step out, feel free to step out. Crime insurance coverage. This, I believe, came to us from Ms. Siglowski and team. And you want to say something about that?
Yeah, I didn't know who had brought it forward. I certainly have a great deal of respect for Ms. Siglowski. She hired me as a superintendent, so I mean that shows to you her good judgment. And in my written comments, I basically said I'm not familiar with the issue. Essentially, what the problem is. I guess it would help me to know a little better. My reaction, and I didn't have a lot of time to respond to this. I think the language is old in this section, so that would be my conclusion, that it should be reviewed. It talks about collectors and treasurers largely. And the issue of performance, or not performance bond, but a fiduciary bond. I am unfamiliar with the Office of Collector in school districts today, so I'm not sure where that, if that language goes back to a time when school districts collected their own taxes. I've never experienced school districts having their own collector. Since Act 60, essentially, towns or municipalities are the collectors. And I know this section pertains to incorporated school districts, so maybe Sue has some detail on that. But I haven't seen school districts having an office of collector. School districts do have treasurers. Treasurers are officers of school districts. In my experience, they are more or less automatically covered by both the liability and the errors and omissions policies of school districts. So I've never seen insurance offered to those people. I've seen them automatically covered by that, particularly the errors and omissions piece that I think would be relative to the bonding requirement.
Yeah, I'm going through the same quandary that you are. It would be great to know what problem is being solved. And I wonder if it is related at all to the concept that the town clerk and the municipal offices actually are responsible for the funds that are collected, and if this is an attempt to transfer that responsibility. I'm clueless.
My comments aren't overly helpful because I'm kind of guessing at what the problem is. If I knew a little better, I could respond.
Yeah, it was brought to Sue's attention by VISBIT, I think it's called, the insurance.
Sure.
VISBIT, yeah. And it was because there's an existing statute, there's this requirement of bonds. So they were trying to modernize it. They kept the word collector because that's in the existing statute. And they were just saying, you don't have to do a bond if you have the suitable crime insurance, because they were differentiating it from the liability insurance that school boards have, things that there was a specific insurance thing that they were trying to fix.
Yeah, that's typically the errors and omissions policy. I mean, I've never, in my tenure as superintendent, we've never bonded a treasurer. And there's two types of treasurers, essentially. I think, I can't comment on incorporated districts because that's a little different, but there's union school district treasurers and there's town school district treasurers. So town school district, I think you're familiar with that construct, where under the law, the town treasurer is the school district treasurer unless the district voters decide otherwise. And 9 times out of 10, the town treasurer is the school district treasurer. In that case, the town treasurer is covered, I would believe, under the town's insurance. So maybe there's an interest. I doubt it from what you're describing, Senator. It sounds like they were doing a little poke at a modernization thing. In union school districts, it's a little different because your union school districts by definition are comprised of multiple town school districts. So the treasurer is an elected office, and those individuals, in my experience, do need to have the coverage because they're often not town officials already, or they're acting in a separate capacity for the union school district. So they are covered. But we've never sought a bond for those individuals. And I've worked with VISBIT as an insurer. When I've reviewed our liability coverage, as I would annually with an auditor, it was always deemed acceptable that we'd have the errors and omissions coverage for all the chief officers of the school district, including school board members.
So it's just that the existing statute says that they shall give a bond to the district. So they're saying, well, we don't do that really. So allows the insurance. So I think they were just trying to we're just trying to modernize it or correct it. My understanding.
Thank you.
So given all that, you don't oppose the language?
No, I don't. I would have to have a tighter description of what the problem is. It sounds like if they're modernizing, that's my diagnosis at the end of my excursion. That they're probably in a hunt for modernization. And hog reeve collector, I think some of those offices should probably be eliminated at some point. But
okay, we can always loop back to Sue on this. Anything else related to this? And then finally, Mr. Secretary, we know you have talked to us a little bit about the teacher shortage. We've heard a number that we have 1,000 openings now for this fall. The numbers likely to rise, to increase, given that people are signing their contracts and making their decisions as we speak. The NEA came forward with a proposal. We know that our friends down the hall, this looks like I just received a message from Approach that this will be something that will likely, in fact, I should say, most of our issues will be taken care of, hopefully on the yield bill. This is one of those items. I don't want to speak for the committee, but we're looking just to help with this situation. We're looking to see how can we get somewhere so that to soften this blow. And we're open to hearing your thoughts on the NEA's proposal. We asked Ledge Council to put together some language. This language just represents a piece of the proposal they put forward. We're happy to get you the entire document, which, in case you haven't seen, is titled Grow Your Own. I think you have a sense of the kind of work it does. And so, yeah, that's where we're at. We do need to get back to our colleagues down the hall. We're going to work on a letter to them today, but it's likely going to be on the yield bill, which I think gives us a little more time. But still, we want to be able to give them a sense of dollar amounts and what those dollars might do and how to effectively use the dollars.
Yeah, sure. And just from a sort of a clinical perspective, I don't dispute the diagnosis by any means, so yeah, sure. It's the cure that I take issue with, and I don't support the proposal for a number of reasons, and I'll review them for my written testimony. Certainly this is a priority. Workforce issues in education and other sectors, we have some issues to address. We have some strategies in flight. I shared with you that we're required to do under the ARP-ESSER plan, right. That was appropriated by the General Assembly last year, and those studies are underway and so forth. We have a more immediate issue on staff wellness that we're engaged in, and we'll be rolling out a major initiative to deal with immediate morale and anxiety levels of staff, which I think is a necessary precondition to move forward. But just to walk through the concerns on this, again, not looking at necessarily the content of their proposal, but just more or less the style of it. There is a need to expand the workforce. That's not the issue. It's not clear to me, just looking at the proposal, how many people would be involved, and it kind of gets to the dollar number, like, what is the impact of this? It's not clear to me. Maybe that's described somewhere else, but the language I saw, it wasn't. My biggest concern has to do with the style of this appropriation. This is just solely my personal perspective as colonel or whatever. Ideally, the General Assembly would, describe the outcomes it wants to see. In this case, you would appropriate the funds, then you would charge the executive branch of the agency with administering a policy to do that. We would then go out to bid through a public process. We would then contract with an entity. Including in that contract would be performance measures. And then we would ultimately report back to you because we're ultimately held accountable by you. This proposal seems to circumvent all those things. It's sort of, it's already designating a contractor. So it's not clear to me to what extent Vermont NEA's services are the best ones for what our needs are, or to what extent they're the best value. So I think that's problematic. I don't like the idea of lack of oversight of the administrative function, because I think we can get into the contracting piece a lot tighter than the General Assembly can. And what I observe here, the only evaluation of this is a report back by the vendor themselves, not an administrative entity familiar with the issues, holding someone accountable for contract implementation. So the procurement issues are problematic to me. And that gets me to the next point. I'm not sure that, I don't know anything about NEA's capacity to do this. If they're the best ones, maybe there's some other entity in the state that'd be interested in doing it. I don't know. Maybe someone could do it better and less value. And I think the taxpayers deserve that level of scrutiny in procurement. That's why we have the regular process. not sure the ed fund is appropriate for this. I don't agree that it's an authorized appropriation. I think in what I saw in draft language is a phrase like notwithstanding section 4,000 of the law. That's a big notwithstanding. I don't think this passes muster as being a qualified educational expense for the ed fund. But
Can you
that's,
say-
that's,
Can you just tell us why? I need a little education on this.
yeah. So for example, we've had two exceptions, and I would say exceptions, two examples when I've been secretary where state level spending has been put in the ed fund. And that was the SSDDMS system and the SLDS system. And when we did that, it wasn't new state level spending. It was basically saying school districts are already generating the spending. And that's the definition of things that go in the ed fund, so it's spending that's generated at the local level, and the state administers the ed fund as sort of a trust. What we were doing with both SLDS and to a greater extent SSDDMS is we're saying school districts are already paying for this software at the local level. It would be cheaper for us to do it at the state level. It all comes out of the ed fund either way, but it's an expenditure that's already occurring at the local level. It's already in the ed fund. Let's just make it more efficient. This expenditure doesn't exist locally. This is state spending, which by definition isn't authorized under the ed fund. But that's you create the rules on that. But I just pointed out.
Yeah.
No, my question is, this has gotten very far down the pathway. So there are some people who are very interested in having some type of program like this.
Yeah.
And what you're suggesting is a different funding source and then some regulatory oversight or more of a grant process. But at this point, it's difficult to branch out and then to put it out to the community for more than the one organization that has suggested this. So my question is, to balance that out, is the language that, as you said, that's here in the bill, and I agree with you, whenever we write our legislation for grants and, for healthcare and others, there's some oversight, there's report back, there's all the accountability that you have talked about. Is there a way to add that into this bill to provide that accountability and provide oversight so that the goals are accomplished? So that's one question. The second question is, obviously, everyone's looking at the excess funds that are available, and looking for that for this purpose. And we don't know, you probably have a finger on the pulse for any ESSER funds that might be available to accomplish the same goal. So those are two questions. Is there another funding source about, and then the oversight piece?
Yeah, I'll try to, I'm going to color it in a little bit. Firstly, just to provide some background, we have initiative under ESSER already in flight on this, and that we've contracted with a national consulting firm, APA Consulting, that does labor, workforce, and education analysis nationally. Their report will come back in December, and that study has four aspects to it. One is to identify what are the education workforce issues, to actually quantify them, because we have a lot of anecdote right now, and this kind of gets to the heart of some of my criticism of this proposal. What's the need here? We don't have good quantification of that. We don't understand the regional patterns. We don't understand the licensing patterns. Is it special ed? Is it math? We don't know. So we're working with them. The first step is to quantify the nature of the education workforce issues. Second piece is to evaluate our regulations, and to what extent do our regulations contribute to workforce shortages. Second point of criticism on this proposal, I used to administer the licensing program at St. Michael's College for principals, curriculum directors, and special ed directors. They were all hypercritical of peer review. No one wants to go through peer review. It's not a easy process. I routinely dealt with people across the state who were like, is there some other way for me to get my license? I do not want to go through peer review. So number two of this evaluation is going to look at our policies. I suspect peer review is going to be called out as critical. It's too slow, it's too labor intensive, it's not going to be responsive enough to our immediate crisis. So I'm not sure why we'd want to put funds into making peer review better when it probably should be limited. The third thing they're going to do is a national scan of what other states are doing in terms of education workforce issues. And then the fourth thing they're doing is adding up those first three, the analysis, a review of our policies, what other states are doing, and they're going to surface policy recommendations for us. And I'll bring those back to you for next session. So, for example, in terms of the nature, this is a crisis area, again, not to dispute the idea, but this is going to require more aggressive action. For an example, Tennessee has adopted, and they're the only one in the country right now, they've received a special dispensation from the U.S. Department of Labor and their own Department of Labor in Tennessee. They have a teacher apprenticeship program. So they're recruiting high school teachers into a program directly, free college credits with their equivalent of CCV, on the job training, and they're at that level. And this is the kind of place we'll probably have to go. Peer review isn't the place that will solve this problem. So at any rate, that's sort of the context of what's already in flight. In terms of improving, your first question had to do, how could we improve this language from a procurement perspective? I think, it would be interjecting the agency as not only the administrator of this, and that's one of my points here. I'm kind of like scratching my head a little bit about what our role would be, because they never consulted with us on this. And to your point, we're pretty far down the pipeline on this. From my perspective, this is like brand new information. This proposal emerged out of nowhere the last end of the session. This is, from my perspective, never been introduced at the beginning of the session, or we were never invited to comment on it. So I don't really know to what extent we could administer the program as it's described in here, because we were never involved in its creation. But I would think if you wanted to strengthen the language, not just have us be the people writing the check, but also have us be the people holding the contract and creating the performance criteria to ensure that the work is being done accordingly, and then also require the agency to report back on its effectiveness, not the vendor itself, to sort of get this more in line with the regular procurement process, because we're going to be able to dig into the details of a contract in a way that you won't be able to. And that's important, I think.
I appreciate everything you're saying, and excited to hear what comes back in December and some of the strategies that we'll work on together. My concern is just this fall and and I know it's your concern as well. And what can we do with some of the funds that we have, or funds that we need to find to help soften what seems to be a really big problem.
This will not affect the fall.
Right.
This is going to help people get into peer review, which is a multi-year process.
Yeah.
So
my
this
question is, right. So what do we do to help the fall? What could we?
The investment. Yeah, it's about. I'm sorry.
No, I'm sorry. You go ahead.
No, I think we think about the workforce issues in near term versus long term. Yeah. So what I described to you was a long term sort of policy analysis. I would argue this peer review approach is a longer term policy, because it doesn't produce enough applicants, and it takes a long time for those people to get through it. I appreciate that people need more support to do it. That's for sure. But it's not a near-term solution. The near-term solution is about retention as much as it's about recruitment. And that's where our wellness policy has to go. And we are targeting the wellness conversation. I have a meeting with VHI PATH program, which is a well-established wellness program in schools already. We're seeking to leverage our ESSER funds to do some work with them. They've expressed interest in that, but that meeting's not scheduled till next week. But I think that's where we need to go first. I always like to quote the governor: when you're in a hole, stop digging. We have to get people's morale boosted back up. And the people that are in the classroom right now, we need to figure out how to sustain them doing this work.
97.
But we still have at least 1,000 applicants,
Absolutely. Yeah, and that ain't.
No, I know we don't want 2,000. So
that solution's not coming anytime soon. But first thing is we got to deal with the wellness issues and morale issues. we can be very flexible on waivers. We have that already available to us, provisional licensing and emergency licensing. So I'm sure we'll see more activity in that come fall.
Yeah, a question, comment, maybe, I know this is going to be shocking to my committee members, but I think it's too much money for this program.
Well, that's my next bullet point.
1.5 million or just under. I think it's a little high, but I just highlighted the first bullet, and you said that there's a need to expand the educator workforce, but it is not clear to what extent this program would help meet that need. And to that, I would say, and I understand and appreciate everything you said, but unless we try something a little more outside the box, how do we don't know if it's going to have great success or fall on its face, right? So I get what you're saying, but we won't know what extent of the program is it going to work or not if we don't try.
Yeah, I would. I appreciate the comments. I was going to try to sneak in my other bullet, which is I think the amount is. I'm not sure. I think the amount is large, and I draw the comparison to the amount of money we invested in 173 professional development. Right. So the General Assembly required us to set aside $200,000 for the entire state's professional development on Act 173. $200,000 for the entire state. And, just to give you a sense of the scale. So I think the amount has to be reined in a bit. I agree with trying things out of the box. This is not out of the box. This is very much in the box. Okay. So this is really trying to support a process in regulation that is not very popular among educators to make it work better. It's a very slow, labor-intensive process that is unlikely to be responsive enough to our immediate crisis in education workforce.
Yeah, I think I don't know if you're aware, Secretary French, that this program is being done now by the union. Okay, and then so the dollar amount, I think it was for 300 individuals, it was like $4,000 a person. So like when I think of it that way, it's not a lot of money, $4,000 per person running through the program. So it comes up to a larger number just because we're trying to push 300 people through the program. But I agree with you. I've heard a lot of complaints about the peer review in the past and but that's the only path, I think, at this point. If you're under a provisional license, I don't know unless going back to school and getting a degree, which is going to take longer, I don't know if there's another path if there is another path.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the point. We need to revise our regulations a bit, or at least examine other solutions. If you're under a provisional license, you have 2 years to fill in the holes, essentially, in your licensing requirements. So for an example, you might be certified to teach high school math, and now you want to teach science. So you get a provisional license to teach science for 2 years, and you have to take 2 or 3 courses to fill in your science background in order to obtain the full credential, and you have 2 years to do that. That's a very common scenario. Principal would be another one. You're hiring a principal in the summer. They have a master's degree in another area, but they don't necessarily have a master's in educational administration. So they have to take courses in the 5 content areas: education, law, finance, supervision, curriculum, and so forth. So that's a common scenario. It's a question of filling in a gap with courses, but not a whole degree. It's really just like maybe 5 courses. And that's the provisional licensing thing has worked out pretty well. The other thing that's going on is reciprocity. We've made some progress. The Standards Board controls that. So that was always a very challenging issue in Vermont. People coming from other states who were licensed, but then we would subject them to the sort of provisional process of evaluating their transcripts and so forth. So we've made some progress there. And my understanding is that New York, we now have full reciprocity with New York, for example, which is not unimportant because we do have a lot of candidates from New York. So we have to work. Those are the policy issues that I think will be identified through this report that I'm talking about, but those aren't going to be online for the fall regardless, because they would all require change in regulation. And that takes a matter of months, a year, shall we say, not going to be ready for the fall. And, again, it's probably not going to be enough. It's not a question. We have to attend to the pipeline issues. We have to attend to recruitment and retention. But the bottom line is there are fewer people out there interested in doing the work. And that's been the case for a number of years. And we're gonna have to start thinking, and this is where a lot of the conversation's going, about how to educate kids with fewer people in the system. And that's unfortunately going to be part of where we're going relative to policy, I think.
Anything else on this topic at this point? This has been very helpful, as usual, having you in. It was great. Very, very helpful. It's given us a lot to consider, and I think in general, helps us to move forward on a number of fronts and, give some additional thought to some of the others. So thank you for that. Anything else for Secretary French at this point?
Just a thought about the morale and, what we were talking about as far as wellness with teachers. And there seems to be kind of a tension here between what you're trying to do to improve the morale and, the conversation we had about rolling out the new regulations for teachers who aren't ready for it. And so, I don't know how you improve morale by insisting that things happen before people are ready for it. So just, keeping those things in mind, trying to balance all of these things with certainly our most important goal to make sure that our kids are well educated.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. It's I think unfortunately it's very complex. It's uncharted territory, what we've gone through. It's not a linear process. But I would start with morale. And I would argue that if people felt better about their work, they'd probably be more interested in moving forward with the regulation. And part of what you're seeing as a response to people feeling like they're not ready is just that they're fatigued, exasperated, and don't have a lot of left in reserve to engage in enthusiastically in implementing new regulatory requirements.
And if forced to go forward in a faster schedule than they're ready, I think will just lead to less than consistent and less than productive implementation.
Yeah, of course, the other side of that is where the kids get left in that. The kids have gone through an incredibly traumatic experience. We have very unique special education regulations in this regard. And it's essentially unfair to wait until the adults are ready to implement these new requirements.
Would you concede, though, that we are serving our children to some extent well as is with the current rules?
Yes, they are, but we're underserving them, and that's a theme that was developed behind Act 173 and has led us in the last couple of years to really move forward with these regulations.
Thank you, Secretary French. Appreciate your availability, and we'll very much appreciate your continued assistance as we hopefully get everything over the finish line in the next couple of weeks.
Thank you.
Have a good afternoon.
You too.
Committee, we're going to go offline, take a 10-minute break, and we'll come back. We'll do review our priorities for the budget, as well as talk a little bit about follow-up from this. And we do have a couple of other items that should be quick, one of which is David Hall hopefully coming in. Daphne's checking on his schedule to walk us through the career technical part of the H703, which is there.